you all for joining me again. Today we're going to be discussing environmental rights. I'm going to be talking a bit about the environment in terms of human rights in the environment, but as some of you will be aware, there's also a lot of other treaties and a lot of other frameworks around environment. So I'm going to give you a brief history on some of them. It will be very brief. There is quite a lot of environmental law, but I hope that this webinar will just give you an introduction, and that you have further questions, you're welcome to ask, and hopefully the webinar will give you some ability to know where to look for further information. But first, I'm going to start specifically talking about human rights and the environment. So here's just a quick video introducing the right to a healthy environment.
The right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is one of the most important human rights of the 21st century. Our home, this beautiful blue-green Earth, is the only planet in the universe known to support life. Yet humans have created a global environmental crisis involving the climate emergency, collapsing biodiversity, pervasive pollution, and a surge in emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin like COVID-19. The right to a healthy environment includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a safe climate, flourishing ecosystems and biodiversity, and toxic-free environments where people can safely live, work, study, and play. This right also includes a procedural toolkit, including access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice with effective remedies. Finally, the right to a healthy environment includes a guarantee of non-discrimination, so it can be enjoyed by everyone, everywhere. The time is now to recognize and implement this vital human right.
So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not proclaim that there is a right to a healthy environment, and the right to a healthy environment is not specifically included in any treaties, but there is a right to a healthy environment. The Human Rights Council Resolution 48-13, passed on October 2021, acknowledged the right to a healthy environment, and you can see some of the text from this resolution on the slide. Following this Human Rights Council resolution, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution with the same wording. The right to a healthy environment links to many other human rights, such as rights to life, to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, to an adequate standard of living, to adequate food, to housing, to safe drinking water and sanitation, and to participation in cultural life for both present and future generations. It also includes non-discrimination. All people have a right to a healthy environment. The exercise of human rights, including the rights to seek, receive, and impart information, to participate effectively in the conduct of government and public affairs, and to participate in environmental decision-making, and to have an effective remedy, are vital to the protection of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Substantive elements to this right include clean air, a safe and stable climate, access to safe water and sanitation, healthy and sustainably produced food, living in a non-toxic environment, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. And as I mentioned, procedural elements include access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice and effective remedies. These resolutions have been called landmark resolutions for their clear message that a healthy environment is a human right. Therefore, the right to a healthy environment has been raised throughout human rights mechanisms of the United Nations. And I'm going to give some examples of this, talking about some of the mechanisms that I discussed in webinar 2. So there have been some individual communications regarding the right to a healthy environment. So here, this was a complaint to the Human Rights Committee. a group of 8 Australian nationals and 6 of their children submitted a petition against the Australian government to the Human Rights Committee. These people were all Indigenous Australians. They were part of the Torres Strait Islands, which you can see in red here on this map. They claimed that changes in weather patterns have harmful direct consequences on their livelihood, their culture, and their traditional way of life. For example, severe flooding caused by a tidal surge in recent years destroyed family graves and left human remains scattered across their island. Furthermore, heavy rainfall and storms degraded the land and trees and have consequently reduced the amount of food available for their traditional fishing and farming. They said that their rights under the Convention on Civil and Political Rights had been violated as Australia failed to adapt to climate change by, for example, upgrading seawalls and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Human Rights Committee found that Australia's failure to adequately protect Indigenous Torres Islanders against adverse impacts of climate change violated their rights to enjoy their culture and to be free from arbitrary interferences with their private life, family, and home. The committee asked Australia to compensate these people for the harm suffered, to engage in meaningful consultations with their communities to assess their needs, and to take measures to continue to secure the community's safe existence on their respectful lands. So this is just one example of the Human Rights Committee acknowledging that there is a right to a healthy environment and asking for measures to address this in regards to Indigenous people. This has also come up in other committees. So here was a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. 16 children from countries around the world submitted a complaint that their countries violated their rights as children by making insufficient cuts to greenhouse gases and by failing to encourage the world's biggest emitters to curb carbon pollution. They claimed their rights to life, health, and prioritization of the children's best interest and cultural life were violated. For example, Deborah Agdabili of Nigeria said that she had been repeatedly hospitalized for asthma attacks that were triggered by rising temperatures and smog. Ellen Ann of Sweden alleges that climate change imperils her Indigenous community's traditional reliance on reindeer herding. These children requested that the committee make findings, including that climate change is a children's rights crisis, and that each respondent country has caused and is perpetuating climate change by knowingly acting in disregard of available scientific evidence. Unfortunately, the committee said that their case was not admissible and could not proceed as they had not exhausted domestic remedies in their country. And you may remember me talking about the exhaustion of domestic remedies a bit in webinar 2. However, the committee still made some interesting points in its judgment. It said that when transboundary damage occurs, the person whose rights have been violated are under the jurisdiction of the state of origin if there is a causal link between the act that originated in its territory and the human rights infringement of persons outside its territory. The committee said that every state must address climate harm outside its territory and is liable for the negative impact of its emissions on the rights of children located both within its country and outside its country. The committee also found that the potential harm of the state's acts or omissions regarding their carbon emissions was reasonably foreseeable to the states. So while this decision, unfortunately, was not upheld and their rights were not found to have been violated, it's still an interesting decision in that it highlights that complaints about the right to a healthier environment can come before these UN committees, and these UN committees are saying that states need to step up in respect to climate change and taking measures to stop this. There are also special rapporteurs related to human rights and the environment. There is a special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is more commonly known as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. This role was first appointed in 2012. The Human Rights Council was mindful that certain aspects of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment required further study and clarification, and therefore created this role. The current Special Rapporteur is David Boyd, and he produced that video that you first saw. However, the former Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, developed 16 principles for states to implement human rights in the context of their environment, and you can see them listed here. So they are things like that the states should ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in order to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And in my first webinar, I touched on what respect, protect, and fulfill means. Number 3 also states that states should prohibit discrimination and ensure equal and effective protection against discrimination, thereby bringing in that the principle of non-discrimination applies when looking at the right to a healthy environment. It also notes in 5 that states should respect and protect the rights of freedom of expression, thereby allowing people to perhaps have protests or say when they feel that their government is not doing enough to impact climate change. Number 14 notes that states should take additional measures to protect the rights of those who are most vulnerable to environmental harm. So, for example, this might be Indigenous people and their way of life are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. So these 16 points from the former Special Rapporteur provide a good summary of how states can uphold the right to a healthy environment. There is also a Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. This is a new Special Rapporteur and was created in 2021. This was done in direct acknowledgement of the effect on human rights of climate change. The first Special Rapporteur is Ian Fry. His first report highlighted the references to human rights in the Paris Agreement, which I'll discuss more later, and considered the human rights implications of actions to uphold the agreement. And his mandate is specifically to study and identify how the adverse effects of climate change and make recommendations about this, to identify existing challenges in states' efforts to promote and protect human rights while addressing the adverse effects of climate change, to synthesize knowledge, including Indigenous and local traditional knowledge, and identify good practices, to promote and exchange views on lessons learned and best practices related to the adoption of human rights-based, gender-responsive, age-sensitive, disability-inclusive, and risk-informed approaches to climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, to raise awareness on the human rights affected by climate change, to facilitate and contribute to the exchange of technical assistance, capacity building, and international cooperation in support of national efforts. And lastly, to integrate a gender-responsive, age-sensitive, disability-inclusive, and social inclusion perspective throughout the work of the mandate. So this is a new mandate and really highlights that the United Nations is taking the right to a healthy environment and the impacts of climate change very seriously. Lastly, and regarding special rapporteurs, there is a Special Rapporteur on the implications for human rights of the environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and waste. This is more commonly known as the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. This is the current Special Rapporteur, Dr. Marcus Orellana. So the exposure of people to harmful substances without their prior informed consent is a human rights issue. Exposure to hazardous substances affects the right to life, health, water, food, and housing. The mandate originally began in 1995 and was focused on things such as traffic pollution, medical waste, extractive industries, and the release of substances during conflict. It has also been expanded and now includes chemical production. The Special Rapporteur currently has two main focuses. First, the duty to prevent exposure. So in 2015, pollution killed an estimated 9 million people, accounting for approximately 16% of all deaths worldwide. Pollution is estimated to be the single largest source of premature death in the world today, and prevention is the exception, not the norm, and the Special Rapporteur is working to make it the norm. There is also a second focus on vulnerable groups. Those who are affected by toxic substances are often vulnerable people, such as women, children, those in poverty, workers, and migrants. They can suffer from cancer, miscarriages, birth defects, heart and lung impairment, learning disabilities, and diabetes, among other illnesses. And therefore, there should be a focus on these vulnerable people. So that was the last of the Special Rapporteurs specifically focused on environmental rights. And that was a brief discussion about the right to a healthy environment. But obviously, the framework around environmental law is larger than that, and I'm going to give you a brief explanation of this framework. So the first treaty focusing on the environment was the Stockholm Declaration of 1972. In the late 60s, there was an idea to have a UN conference focusing on human interactions with the environment. This conference was convened in Stockholm in June 1972. It was attended by 114 countries. It was called the Conference on the Human Environment. This conference led to the creation of the UN Environmental Programme. The conference also resulted in the Stockholm Declaration, of which you can see some here. The declaration contained 26 principles concerning the environment and development, and an action plan with 109 recommendations. There was a focus on recognition for poverty alleviation for protecting the environment. It placed environmental issues at the forefront of international concerns and marked the start of a dialogue between industrialized and developing countries on the link between economic growth and pollution and the well-being of people. So this was the first international document on environmental law, and it was the beginning and the first step in the framework of international environmental law. 20 years after the Stockholm Declaration, the United Nations convened a second international meeting, the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And this was to assess events during the intervening years, to focus on the relationship between environmental protection and economic development, and for member states to collaborate on global issues such as sustainability. The conference was held in Rio in June 1992. Issues discussed included protection of the atmosphere, freshwater resources, marine environment, land resources, biological diversity, and management of biotechnology and wastes. The conference resulted in the Rio Declaration of Environment and Development, some of which you can see here. This declaration contains 27 principles to guide the future of development. The principles define the right of people to development and their responsibilities to safeguard the environment. For example, Principle 3 is the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. Principle 11 is states shall enact effective environmental legislation. Environmental standards, management objectives, and priorities should reflect the environmental and development context to which they apply. Standards applied by some countries may be inappropriate and of unwarranted economic and social cost to other countries, in particular developing countries. However, this was only a declaration and contained principles, so wasn't legally binding. But at this conference, other documents were created and signed. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as the name suggests, provides a framework for the international climate change regime, and this was first discussed at the Rio conference. This framework recognizes that there is a problem with climate change and sets a goal to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It said that parties should adopt their own national policies to mitigate climate change. It put the onus on developed countries as opposed to developing countries to take the lead in providing funding and in implementing measures to reduce greenhouse gases. Developed countries were listed in Annex 1 of the framework. This framework also acknowledged scientific uncertainty around climate change, but stated that this was not a reason to postpone measures. It established a framework for ongoing meetings known as the Conference of Parties, or you may have heard them referred to as COP. It also established a framework for ongoing research, reporting on national measures, and the development of future agreements. So I'm now going to discuss some of those future agreements. So the framework for climate change has progressive agreements that occur at the annual COP. So I'm going to talk about some of these bigger agreements. So the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997. It committed state parties to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It did this by obligating state parties to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage compared to a base year, which was listed in this protocol. These commitments only applied to developed countries that were listed in Annex 1. The first period for these commitments was from 2008 to 2012. In 2009, the Copenhagen Accord was adopted. It's only an accord, so not a legally binding instrument. It specified the goal of keeping global temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius. It asked for Annex 1 countries, that's the developed countries, to continue to make reduction commitments under the Kyoto Protocol up to 2020. So it extended that commitment period for another 8 years. In 2010, the Cancun Agreement called on Annex 1 countries, so developed countries, to continue reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Copenhagen Accord. It also stated that developing country parties should take their own appropriate mitigation actions. The Cancun Agreement urged developed countries to increase the ambition of their emissions targets, and that they would be supported and enabled by technology, financing, and capacity building. In 2011 came the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action. At this conference, parties agreed to launch a process to develop a protocol or another legal instrument that could be used after the Kyoto Protocol, although at this conference, they hadn't yet decided on what this legal instrument would be. Therefore, in 2012, the Doha Agreement called for an extension of the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. This was known as the second commitment period. Many countries did not commit to the second commitment period. The countries who did commit to the second period were predominantly members of the EU, and they contributed only 15% of global carbon emissions. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the Paris Agreement in 2015, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and know about. The Paris Agreement takes another approach to the global climate regime. It is a bottom-up approach, so a state's contribution is determined nationally by the state itself. All states, no matter if they are developed or developing, are to make nationally determined contributions. The countries are no longer split into annexes, and all countries are expected to contribute. The commitments under this agreement began in 2050. So the Paris Agreement outlines the current obligations of states regarding climate change. And here is a brief video to explain the Paris Agreement.
What is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This requires economic and social transformation to face the climate challenges now and moving into the future based on the best available science. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action. By 2020, countries communicate their plans known as nationally determined contributions. Countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. This may include information on adaptation and finance flows. The Paris Agreement also provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Starting in 2024, countries report transparently on actions taken. Collective progress under the Paris Agreement will be assessed through a global stocktake. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans in the next round.
So that's a brief introduction to the Paris Agreement, and I'm sure there are people here who are much more knowledgeable than me in the Paris Agreement. However, given that this is a human rights and legal seminar, I thought it would be interesting to note that there have been numerous cases brought by people, particularly young people, in national courts about the government's lack of response to climate change and for their governments not upholding the Paris Agreement. Held versus Montana is a very recent case, with a judgment being delivered on the 14th of August this year. 16 young people from the American state of Montana alleged that their state government was not upholding the right to a healthy environment, and that the state government supported and encouraged fossil fuel extraction and burning. The judge declared that the state of Montana violated the children's constitutional rights under the Montana's constitution, including their rights to equal protection, dignity, liberty, health and safety, and public trust, which are all predicated on their right to a clean and healthy environment. The court invalidated Montana's laws that promoted fossil fuels and required turning a blind eye to climate change, and said that these laws were unconstitutional. The court further stated that Montana's emissions cause and contribute to climate change, and that every additional ton of greenhouse gas pollution warms the planet, and that harm will grow increasingly severe and irreversible without science-based actions to address climate change. There have been a few cases along this, and perhaps more cases will continue. And it is interesting to note that this is a tactic used by many people in getting their governments to address climate change. So, as I mentioned a few slides ago, the framework for climate change was introduced in Rio in 1992, but other documents were also created in Rio at this time. So here's one, Agenda 21. So Agenda 21's aim was to achieve global sustainable development by 2000. And the 21 in its name refers to the target date of the 21st century. It was an action plan for sustainable development that included objectives around combating poverty, conservation, health, and sustainable trade, and activities of how these things could be achieved. It was just a non-binding document, but was the start of things to come. 10 years after the Rio conference and 30 years after the Stockholm conference, the World Summit on Sustainable Development took place in Johannesburg in August and September 2002. This conference was specifically looking at sustainable development. The conference adopted a political declaration and implementation plan. The declaration committed nations of the world to build a humane, equitable society and a global society cognizant of the need for human dignity for all. And it also built on the declarations of previous summits. This declaration is very general, much more so than other documents following the Rio summit. It focuses on the worldwide conditions that pose severe threats to the sustainable development of our people, including chronic hunger, malnutrition, foreign occupation, armed conflict, drug problems, organized crime, corruption, natural disasters, illicit arms trafficking, trafficking in person, terrorism, xenophobia, chronic disease, and chronic diseases. The implementation plan set out a specific timetable to address these issues. This included reducing the rate of loss of biodiversity and halving the number of people without access to drinking water. And this built on Agenda 21. Furthermore, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, or Rio Plus 20, took place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in June 2012, 30 years after the first Rio summit and 10 years after Johannesburg. At this conference, the non-binding document, The Future We Want, was finalized. It mostly reaffirmed Agenda 21, but importantly, launched a process to develop a set of goals. And these goals are the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and are aware of. So here, I'm just going to play a short video about the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as they are commonly known.
Did you know that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action that unites 193 countries around the world? If these global goals are fulfilled by 2030, life on Earth will be better for everyone. So, what are these goals? Eliminate poverty in all its forms. No hunger. Everyone should have safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. Everyone has equal access to healthcare, thus ensuring our well-being and a healthy life. Equal access to a quality education. Ensure gender equality where women and girls have the same opportunities as men and boys. By achieving these goals, each member of our society will be equal, safe, and happy. UN global goals also include access to safe drinking water and sanitation, access to clean energy that is safe for people and the environment, sustainable and stable economic growth. Everyone has a decent job, strong infrastructure, and the support of innovations. Lower inequality within and among countries. Cities and settlements be developed without damaging the environment and people. Achieving these goals will result in the well-being of people and our planet. We can further take care of our environment with the following goals: sustainable and safe production and consumption of products. Take urgent measures to reduce climate change and its impact. Ensure the sustainable use and protection of ocean and sea resources. Restore and protect Earth's ecosystems. By achieving these goals, we will form a society where strong institutions ensure peace and justice. It is important for everyone to be involved and to build partnerships for achieving sustainable development goals. You are part of this process. Demand the implementation of these goals. Take the lead and share information with your friends.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted in 2015 by the UN General Assembly. It provides a blueprint for peace and prosperity. The Sustainable Development Goals are a collection of 17 interlinked objectives, which you can see here. Each objective lists goals and targets. For example, Goal 15 is life on land. Its objective is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. The 9 targets include to ensure conservation of mountain ecosystems. This target then has 2 indicators: coverage by protected areas of important sites for mountain biodiversity and the Mountain Green Cover Index. While the Sustainable Development Goals are not legally binding, countries are encouraged to implement their own sustainable development policies, plans, and programs. Countries are also encouraged to develop their own national indicators to assist in monitoring progress made on the goals and targets. Civil society can play a crucial role in implementation. Civil society has been described by the United Nations Secretary General as linking government and people. So NGOs play an important role as partners on the ground. So there are many environmental concerns and many treaties. And many treaties have subsequent treaties, as I have shown with the climate change framework. I have listed a few environmental treaties here as an illustration. Most environmental conferences, when new treaties are discussed or treaties are updated, involve civil society. So you can be involved if you want to be. And if you are, I would suggest keeping an eye on the United Nations Environmental Programme's webpage. Also, if you are interested in a specific environmental issue, you could see if there is a treaty dealing with that specific issue. Most environmental treaties do not have a monitoring body like human rights treaties do. The United Nations Environment Programme will work to help implement environmental treaties, but there are not ways to lodge individual complaints like there are for human rights treaties. However, there is a right to a healthy environment, and United Nations human rights mechanisms and also local courts are beginning to recognize this and give effect to this. So you may like to consider how you could use that. That's a very, very brief summary of the wide international environment law and mechanisms